This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome everybody to another edition of Squash Canada's Coach PD webinar series. We're very thrilled to have our webinar today featuring Jesse Engelbrecht from over across the pond, who's going to be talking to you today about SquashMind. And it's a mental skills toolkit. I'll let him get into the specifics about it, but Jesse is a very experienced coach. He's director of squash at squashkills.com. As well as he's been part of that new WSF online foundation course, designer and tutor with that. So he has a ton of experience that I think you're really going to enjoy hearing about today. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. If you have questions, just hold them to the end, and then we'll have a very engaging conversation once Jesse finishes this presentation. So take it away, Jesse.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks, Squash Canada. This is really cool to be able to jump on and talk more about one of my passions, something that I'm really loving doing at the moment, working on the mental side of the game for players, not just for their squash performances. I actually do a lot of zooming out and look at how they deal with conflict in life and difficult situations or conversations with parents or family or school. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully I can bring a little bit of interesting information to the party. I'm going to run through a few slides, but I'm going to consciously not just go slides, death by slides. There's a few other things I want to show you, and let me jump on in. So SquashMind, in very simple terms, let's talk about what I want to have a look at today in particular. So the basic structure, I'm going to give about a 40-minute presentation. It might be slightly less, slightly longer. And I want to build in a 20-minute Q&A towards the end. So that's going to be the rough structure of how I want to go through things today. What I would like is, while I'm presenting stuff and talking about some of the ideas I'm working on with the players and athletes, please use the chat box feature. Throw some questions into there, because I think once I get into a bit of a flow, it might be nice for me to try to get my points across. But if anything pops in your mind that you think, actually, I want to ask a question about that, please feel free to jump in the chat box, and I'll try obviously go at the end and use that as part of the Q&A. And what's also going to happen throughout, what we'll announce it at the end with Jeffrey's help, is I'm going to give 5 free codes away for the app for 1-year access. The app is worth 70 pounds for the year, £70. So hopefully some good value for people to use the app if they want to, or give the code away to a friend or family member that might want to use it as well. So bit of my thanks to you guys for making the effort to come on, and also to Squash Canada for the little thanks as well. So looking a little bit at the learning outcomes, there are going to be 3 topics I want to present today that are part of the SquashMind syllabus. I've designed the syllabus that it's relatively broad, but also goes quite deep in those certain fields. So today's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour into 3 of the topics that I introduced to my players really early on in regard to the education, in regard to using the app, and yeah, just want to talk about that. Ideally, we're going to get a deeper understanding of some mental training. So hopefully you'll come away from this with a slightly clearer knowledge of some parts of the mind, and how to implement some mental training, whether it be for yourself, if you reflect on yourself, or whether it be for the players you're working with, going, actually, here's a bit of a toolkit we can use to improve some of the mental side. I also want to look at how the app can be used and applied. I'm going to run through, it's the first time I'm doing this, but I've got a little program where I can share the app on the screen, and I'll navigate through the app as we go along. And then finally, I want to bring it around to what the SquashMind philosophy is based on, and that also might spark some curiosity in your minds in regard to how you form mental training and how you can get mental training as part of your player's toolkit. Okay, so I'm going to dive straight in for the very first thing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second. So the very first topic I'm going to talk about is what I call expectations versus reality. Okay, so with me stopping to share the screen, or maybe sorry, you might not have seen any of that screen, by the way. Jeffrey, were you able to see any of that screen or not?
No.
No, okay, that's fine. It was very basic, a couple of basic slides, so my apologies. But what we're going to start with, I'll share the screen here now. It should be a bit easier. So I thought I had it on. It's just using Canva is a little bit different on this process. So what I just went through really quickly was started with that slide, And this is the structure for today. Sorry if you didn't see that, but I was just talking through that, the 40-minute presentation, 20-minute Q&A, going through those things. And this is what I want to talk about now, is the expectations versus reality. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I need to open another little bit, and then I'm going to show you exactly what this looks like. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, so expectations versus reality. This is something I present quite early on in SquashMind, and it's the whole concept of expectations versus reality, of when we're trying to form a habit or a skill with our players. And what tends to happen is when we enter this journey, this is what we think should happen. So our expectations is a beautiful straight line. We're working on a skill, whether it's the backhand volley drop or movement pattern or an idea in our game, and we think with continual work we're gonna go like that. That's our expectations. But in reality, it's a little bit messier. This tends to happen a little bit. You know, that line is a lot more up and down. There's a lot more squiggles in it. It's not as neat and as structured as our expectations. So I think it's important to understand that our reality and our expectations are sometimes two different things. So when a player, or even us, when we're learning a skill, when our reality drops below our expectations, so these little troughs below that green line, this is when doubt and questioning comes in. You know, you start asking yourself, am I doing the right thing? Should I change what I'm doing? You know, so there's a lot of doubt and questioning when our reality drops below our expectations. But on the other side, when our reality starts to surpass our expectations, we get confidence and momentum. We get this feeling that we're doing the right thing, and we're almost surprised with it sometimes. But I just want to make a point about these two areas: when we are below our expectations and when we are above our expectations, or within the players. Both of these have their pitfalls, and both of them are areas that we've got to be conscious and aware of. Obviously, in the doubt and questioning phase, that's what happens. We question, we might give up on that skill. We might not believe in what we're doing because we're not quite seeing those results. And then equally so, if I just flip it to the confidence and momentum phase, if we get that confidence and momentum, sometimes we get the players feeling like they've arrived. I got this. I don't need to put any more work in. And maybe there's a passivity goes on, where they're a little bit passive and they're not quite putting the work in. And what I really encourage with the players, and something big I work on with SquashMind, is we've got to identify your processes and your controllables, and we've got to stick to those, especially in that doubt and questioning phase. We've got to understand that, okay, we've put these daily and weekly habits in place, and what processes are you doing to make sure that you go and you get those results you want. And it's hard. It's a hard sell. It's not an easy sell, this one. But I think with good communication between coaches and players, and good understanding and good clarity, I think the players can accept that their reality is below their expectations, but they're on a journey. That red line will get up to that green line and surpass it a few times. So for me, when we're in that doubt and questioning, it's about processes. What are we doing on a daily and weekly basis? That's the right thing that we need to cultivate and keep working on, because that line will go up. And then equally so on the other side of the line, when we've got confidence and momentum, it's about staying grounded. It's about appreciating the processes have got us to this point, so we need to reinforce them. We need to keep doing them. Yes, they need to change and they need to evolve when a player develops and things move on. But I'm really big on trying to understand that, you know what, just because you're seeing immediate success and things are going well straight away, it doesn't mean you can rest on your laurels. The next little phase of this model, my expectations reality model, is what I call the fluctuating period. It's this little period where everything's unstable, and you know, on one day the player will really get it. Backhand volley drops going in, it's great, it's confident. They'll then play a match the next day and it'll just disappear. They'll come to training, it won't happen. Then they'll play a match another day and it will appear. And it's this level of inconsistency that I think is arguably one of the most dangerous periods in this model, because even though the players might be doing the right thing, it's the inconsistency that actually can get players to give up and just be like, I'm done, I'm walking away from this. So I'm really aware at the fluctuating period that the conversations I try to have with my players is just this. It's getting them to understand, hey, listen, you're in just this inconsistent mode at the moment. It's going to be fine if we are doing the right things and we both are on the same page with this. Moving on to the next little part of the model, and this is partly my experience, partly research, partly talking to lots of coaches and lots of athletes. There tends to come this extended plateau of no improvement, where the player's doing the right things, they're feeling that there's a bit of confidence, but they're not ever stepping up above the level they were at. And this can go on for a long time. And what can end up happening is you start off that your reality is better than your expectations, but because you don't see the results, say, over the course of a few weeks, a few months, even getting into 6 months, your reality drops back below your expectations, because that line stays horizontal, but your expectations are going up. So it's a really interesting little period where there's no improvement. Things are going okay, but just be aware that the mindset shift can actually go, oh, okay, I've dropped below my expectations now. And I always find this so fascinating. It's happened to me many times when I'm trying to learn a skill or a habit and get it right. There tends to be that little dip before that big kickoff, before that big result comes or that skill gets learned. And it's one of the most frustrating things for a player to work and work and work and work, and then actually for a few days go backwards, actually go below the level that they've been at for, several weeks. But if we can get the player to understand and go, actually, you know what, this is part of it. If we trust in this, we will get that little kickoff. And, I really believe that if as coaches, and this is, I show this model to my players a few times to just get them to understand and appreciate where they're at, to not try and rush things, to not think the finish line is just there and I need to get there in the shortest space of time. It's trying to present to them that it's a journey. We're on this journey and we want to embrace this journey that we're on, and we don't necessarily have to rush it. And yeah, I just think it's quite a good thing to present to the players relatively early on. It's one of my first things I speak about when I work with, let's say, a new family or a new player, to go, right, let's understand our expectations versus reality. And it's something that's really interesting when we check back on it, say in 6 months' time when we're in one of these strange periods, the player goes, I get it. Yes, right, that's okay, cool. I'm going to be a bit more patient and I'm going to understand it a little bit more. Okay, so that's one of the first things I wanted to present, and just go, as I said, a little whistle-stop tour of that. As I said, I'm going to encourage you to throw in questions if anything's popping in your mind that you are unsure of or need a little bit more clarification on. More than happy to talk a little bit more about it. Okay, so I'm going to share my next little part of the screen now. Hopefully get it right this time. Okay, give me a sec while I navigate this. Okay. So there's a nice image of it. And again, after this, I'm happy to give you the PDF. You can take it. Actually, a few coaches in the clubs around here have actually put it up on their junior coaching boards to make sure that the players know about it. The second thing I want to talk about is growth versus fixed mindset. Again, really early on, I do this lesson. And for me, it's one of the key fundamentals, one of the key cornerstones in regard to working on the mind, understanding that the mental training is a huge part of life, and how we want to really make sure that we're doing the right thing. So some of you might have come across growth or fixed mindset in the past, and I just want to give you my version of this and talk through it as we go through. So Carol Dweck, professor of psychology at Stanford, she spent over 40 years conducting numerous studies on growth and fixed mindset. She is the forerunner of this territory in this field, and it's really filtered into so many sports and environments and just situations that I see a lot of it on. And it's all about how we conduct ourselves when we're confronted with threats or challenges or difficult situations. And according to Dweck, individuals can be placed on a continuum from growth on one side to fixed on the other side. And we're never completely growth and we're never completely fixed. So let's not think that we pigeonhole ourselves into just one category. It's a bit of a moving continuum. And what you'll find is, in things that you like doing, you're going to be naturally drawn more towards the growth side, but things that might be out of your comfort zone, that poses a challenge, might be more towards your fixed mindset. But I think it's important for us as coaches, and something I talk about with my players, is to not fear failure and actually reframe failure into feedback. How can failure and how can the process of failure be embraced in a way that it's actually data and feedback for improving? And I'm going to get into that in a little bit more. So some character traits of growth mindset individuals: they tend to show greater resilience. They have the ability to bounce back from setbacks, and they're better able to handle threats, take criticism, and problem solve. I actually really like that take criticism one. I'm not sure about you coaches out there, but you know, when you get a player and they're relatively talented and they can do things pretty good, and if you criticize them or say, hey, listen, I think you're not doing this quite as well, and they get all defensive and they go, oh no, like no, I'm doing it well. And so maybe it's quite interesting to understand that that's just a little bit of a characteristic trait of a fixed mindset. They're comfortable with where they're at and they're almost not willing to get out of that comfort zone. Just a little bit more about growth mindset. People with growth mindset tend to have a hunger for learning and a desire to work hard to get the results. And there's a love of the process of the task. It's really interesting with the study she's done. Some of the students actually love the process more than even the outcome. They really get into the process of what they're doing. And for me, that's great. I mentioned process and the expectations versus reality model. But yeah, the whole process around the task and actually embracing that is a huge, huge character trait of someone who's got a growth mindset. Growth mindsets see failure as feedback, and they reframe threats into challenges as an opportunity to learn and grow. I just want to repeat that. So they see failure as feedback, and they reframe threats into a challenge as an opportunity to grow. I think that's brilliant. If we can see that threat and that challenge to go, okay, I might not be there today, but I'm going to reach for it, and I'm probably going to fail, but that's my opportunity to get better and grow. I'm really big into this reaching and failing type idea. I've been looking at quite a lot recently. It goes a little bit with the flow state, and I'm going a bit off topic here, but I think it's an interesting chat. When we want to get our athletes into a flow state, that's great, but all that flow does is express what they can already do. Whereas if we're getting our athletes into a state of reach but fail, reach but fail, reach but fail, that's where a lot of neuroplasticity takes over and a lot of real learning and growth happens in the reach but fail type state. So it's quite an interesting debate between the flow-inistas about everything needs to be flow and connected, or the high challenge environment. And I think as coaches, if we can get that balance right between presenting the high challenge to our players, but encouraging the growth mindset traits, I think we're into something really good there. So I'm just going to flip it into fixed mindset, which is worth talking about. Fixed mindset character traits: people are typically likely to give up more and avoid the challenge or the threat altogether. They tend to blame other factors for the failure. Think about that. They blame other factors for the failure. A lot of fixed mindsets language is based on, it was the referee's fault, or the conditions were not very good. You know, blaming other factors, almost no ownership for what they've done. And Carol Dweck, it's a great quote from her. She says, every situation calls for a confirmation of their intelligence, personality, or character. Every situation is evaluated. Will I succeed or fail? Will I look smart or dumb? Will I be accepted or rejected? They are seeking constant validation for all areas in their lives. Think how stressful that is. You know, I think, reflect on yourselves. I know there's been many times I've been in a fixed mindset trade, especially when I was a player, and actually understanding that, you know what? It's so stressful. It takes so much energy. It takes so much effort to be thinking, will I look smart or dumb? Will I succeed or fail? And actually, if we can reframe it, for me, that's where the real power and magic lies. Okay, so Carol Dweck, she's dedicated a huge amount of her life to these studies, as I said, and I just want to talk a little bit about the studies. So in a repeated study over several decades, children that were praised on their intelligence and talent for solving a problem were far more likely to exhibit fixed mindset characteristic traits in future difficult situations. Whereas children that were praised on the process, their efforts, their strategies, their focus, and their perseverance showed vastly improved growth mindset traits on future difficult situations. So the form of praise the children received actually pushed them to one side or the other side of the continuum. So they were hearing these messages from the teachers or people they respected. And what was really interesting about the further part of the study, when they tested these kids at a future study 6 months down the line, when the children were asked to present back their results to the teacher, the fixed mindset group actually lied about what they scored. So they were asked, just tell us what you got, because the fixed mindset children didn't want to be seen as failing. They didn't want to be seen as less than their counterparts. So they started exaggerating their results for these tests, which again, really fascinating that there was such a protection over failure and they were so scared of it. And listen, for 1 second, I'm not saying we want to embrace failure, but we don't want to encourage failure all the time. We want the small wins along the way. Of course we do. We want to see progress. We want to see things improving. But if we continually judging it on success or fail, or will I succeed or not, that we're setting ourselves up for fail, and we're setting our players up to fail there. So what's interesting is how can we move towards this growth mindset for ourselves and our players? So I think it's important to understand the learning behind it, but let's talk about the practical tool as well, because that's ultimately what SquashMind is trying to do, is go with this practical tool. The big thing is language, and the way it is used in regard to our belief systems is immensely powerful. The language we hear from others plays a crucial role in our identity, but what is of even more importance is our own inner voice, our own language, our own dialogue, and the way we perceive and the way we look at the world and the way we look at these confrontations and challenges. So for me, the big thing I try to get is become aware of your inner voice and the tone and words you use to describe threats and difficulties. That for me is so essential. Awareness and clarity is arguably one of the most top things I try to do with SquashMind. Even if we're not there yet and we haven't succeeded in what we're trying to do, if you are aware of what you're trying to do and you're really clear with it, do you know what? You've taken a massive step in the right direction. So the awareness of the language that we have in our mind, or how we speak to ourselves when we're confronted with a challenge, is massive. It's the first big step in the right direction. And I'll get on to the next little bit in a second, but I just wanted to really make the point that the awareness, so often we're only aware after the fact, after we failed in the task, once it's finished, and then go, oh yeah, I went into that task or that challenge with a very fixed mindset. If you can see it slightly earlier and quicker, that's where we really want to be with it. So professor of psychology at Santa Clara University, Shauna Shapiro, she's a neuroscientist. She talks about the brain and strengthening of the neural pathways and the synapses, and ultimately our identity, in this really wonderful saying. She says, what we practice grows stronger. And we're talking just about the brain here. So what we practice grows stronger. If we practice judgment, we grow judgment. If we practice impatience, we grow impatience. If we practice frustration, we grow frustration. If we practice fear, we grow fear. So it's all those neural pathways, those messages, those continual reinforcing of those pathways that become really entrenched and ingrained. And us as coaches, hopefully we can be the custodians to try and change that language and actually help the players do it themselves. So I want to talk a little bit more about the final tool I've got on here, the power of yet and get. So two very, very important words. And I'm always reminding my players of it, just nudging them, just thinking about, right, yet and get, yet and get. They're probably sick of me here saying it now. So let me give you a bit of an example. So if you're struggling to do something and your inner voice has already made up its mind, add the word yet to the end of that sentence. Carol Dweck talks about the power of the word yet, and she's done multiple studies on this. So for example, I'm not going to be good enough to compete at that level. I've already said, I can't compete at that level, but I'm not going to be good enough to compete at that level yet. So simple. I think it all makes sense to us here, but actually just that word can just reframe it a little bit into the growth mindset side. I cannot execute that shot like I want. The backhand volley drop, the forehand lob, I cannot execute it. I cannot execute that shot yet. And finally, I get frustrated playing this opponent and cannot beat them. I can never beat that person. I can't beat them. Hey, add the word yet. I can't beat that opponent yet. So if you observe how the word yet added to the end of the sentences gives the feeling of being on a journey. It's about this journey again, going back to that expectations versus reality model. It's about the journey. We can't do it, but you know what? We're not there yet, but with the right training and the right direction, on the court, off the court, with our mind, we're getting there. And then secondly, the word the word get. So let me give you a couple of examples, like reframing the word have to get. So if there's a sentence that you have in your mind, see if you can reframe it with the word get. So I have to go to the courts and train again this week, even though I'm tired. So already made up your mind, oh, I have to go get that session. But if you say, I get to go to the courts, train again this week, even though I'm tired, reframes it there straight away. Another one, I have to spend time working on my mental side of the game, or I get to spend time working on my mental side of the game. And finally, I'm feeling unconfident and flat, but I have to play this match. Actually, I'm feeling unconfident and flat, but I get to play this match. So think about how it completely changes the tone there. And think about how lucky we are in, the first world and all the things we're sitting here and over the, ocean talking about this. We get to do so many things. We get to take the trash out. We get to do chores. Think about how many millions of people in the world would love to get to do that. They don't even have the luxury to do that. Thinking about people living in slums in India or wherever, it's difficult out there. And it just gives maybe myself and yourself and players a bit of a perspective going, yeah, listen, don't really complain about having to go to the courts and play. Actually, you get to go to the courts and play. So we're going into that growth mindset a little bit more. So just in closing with growth versus fixed mindsets, like I said, become aware of your inner voice and the language you use when you're confronted with difficult situations. Are you perceiving them with a fixed or growth mindset? If you have a fixed outlook on them, you're likely to continue to see them as a threat. That's so important. If your players are seeing things as a threat and they continue to see it as a threat, us as coaches need to try and pivot that and push them towards the growth side. So if you can reframe this threat into a challenge by using the growth mindset look, I think you're going to find a lot of positivity along the way. Awareness and reframing are the fundamental tools that need to be practiced and developed. So the awareness and then the reframing. So awareness is nothing without the reframing. It's fine to be aware of these negative thoughts or this fixed mindset sentence we have, but we also need to reframe it a little bit. And I just want to finish with Carol Dweck's quote there at the bottom. She says, in a growth mindset, challenges are exciting rather than threatening. So rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to reveal my weaknesses, you say, wow, here's a chance to grow. So yeah, hopefully there's a few little sparks flying off in your guys and girls heads there. That little graphic just above with the growth and fixed mindset, I use that one often. There's a few really good little sentences in there, the I can learn and do anything I want from the growth. My effort and attitude determine my abilities. That's probably one of my favorite one in the growth. On the fixed side, failure is the limit of my abilities. My potential is predetermined. It's already been made up. So yeah, for me, I think hopefully that sparks a few little things in your mind, as well as thinking, right, how can I do this with my players? Okay, I'm going to take a little breath for a second because I know I'm running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Get excited and passionate about this stuff. I will flick onto the next screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute. As I said, anything popping in mind, please throw some questions in, have a little discussion about it. I will open up a Q&A towards the end about stuff we've spoken about, or any new stuff as well that we want to have a little look at. Okay, my third and final bit I want to present to you today is on the concept of visualization. This is pretty much where SquashMind started or actually it was just before lockdown. A lot of my players were reaching out to me saying, great, we're on the court, we're working, but you know what else can I do for my mind? And I just started recording just on my phone, just some visualization scripts, visualization follow-alongs that the players would listen to 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes on different parts of the game. And it started to become quite good and successful, and they liked it. And you know what? The whole thing then went into the app. But visualization for me, this is a key part of mental toughness and mental training. So let me talk about some of the research I've done with visualization and a lot of what I talk about. Okay, so the brain, it's a live tissue, it's active. It can be built up and toned through the right exercises, but these must be actively reinforced. There is a bit of a debate there whether the brain is a muscle, so I haven't used the word muscle in there because I have been shot down a couple of times because it's still not quite proven one way or the other, but there's no argument that the brain is a live tissue and it needs that active stimulation. What's really fascinating is the studies. So studies have time and again shown that the brain cannot tell the difference between the actual event and the vivid visualization of that same event. The same neural pathways, the same parts of the brain are lighting up, are firing up when we visualize as if we're doing the same experience. Okay, our nervous system isn't quite responding in the same way. That's a different topic. but our brain and the synapses and the neurons and the highways I talk about are getting stronger and stronger when you do a vivid visualization. So not just like, oh, I'm seeing roughly myself hit the ball. We go into a bit of detail with the visualization, and the more colors and sounds and sights we can put onto it, that makes a huge difference. Being able to taught to visualize effectively and being taught how to do it in an easy and accessible way creates these real powerful habits that are transferred into performance. And this is from, I'll talk a bit more about those studies in a minute, but it's been proven many times from athletes' firsthand experience to lab-based studies about actually when you make visualization a habit, the transference does go into matches. One of my favorite studies is the brain scans of London taxi drivers. So they were able to get them under the brain scanning machines, and the posterior hippocampus, which is a part of the brain related to learning and memory, is physically larger and has grown after they acquired the knowledge. I'm not sure if you know what the knowledge is, but the knowledge is the test London taxi drivers have to take. It's pretty much the same length as doing a degree. It takes about 3 or 4 years, where they have to memorize the routes and roads all around London without a sat nav. They have to just replay it, they have to visualize it, they have to go through it time and time and time again. It's excruciating what they have to do. It's kind of crazy in this world with sat navs now, but it's still something they have to do. But what's interesting is when those taxi drivers retired, that part of the brain that was physically bigger, it was bigger than other people that hadn't done the visualizations, shrunk back down to almost this normal size. So basically was showing that the brain is plastic, even in adulthood. These guys were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and the posterior hippocampus, the brain, that part of the brain for learning and memory, has grown. It was like they were taking their mind to the gym and actually doing metaphorical push-ups and actually stretching that muscle in that part of the brain because they were rehearsing it time and time again. I wanted to take a second to talk about David Hemery. Some of you might have heard of him or not. He was a very early adopter of visualization. So in 1968, he was the 400-meter hurdles gold medalist in the Mexico Olympics. So high altitude, really difficult situations. British athlete, wasn't really fancied with this, but he did so many visualizations. And here's some of his words. He talks directly about this. What he says, I intended to win. It wasn't just a hope to win. And he goes on to discuss all the detail he paid to the race itself. He says, I saw myself winning the race in each and every lane of the track, starting from lane 1 right through to lane 8. I saw myself in various different positions of the race, leading, in the middle, and fighting right from the back. But everything ended up with me crossing the line in front of my fellow athletes. You don't want to be drawn in one of the outside lanes for a final, but in that actual Olympics, he was drawn in lane 7. So he was drawn in arguably the second worst lane. But what had happened, he was able to execute. He had visited it in his mind. He had rehearsed it in his mind so many times over. And it wasn't just the result. I just want to make a point here about, not for 1 second am I saying visualization is about seeing yourself lifting the trophy. That's actually really negative in a way. That actually gets players to visualize on the outcome rather than the processes. What David Hemery was doing, he was visualizing where he started, how the first few strides would go. Was he at the middle, front, back of the race? He was visualizing the processes and the strategies to be able to execute. Okay, yes, he saw himself winning, so that was the end point, but the main parts of the visualization were all based on processes. So I think it's a really, really big point to make. I fell into the trap when I was a player. I got introduced to visualizations, but a lot of it was that almost that overly optimistic, positive jump out of bed. Hey, I'm the world champion, punching the air type vibe, and it works to a tiny degree, but it's actually fake positivity. It's not real. It's this outcome. There needs to be daily and weekly habits and routines that are being put in place to make it happen. So if you are going to get your players to enter a visualization process, I would highly recommend that it's much more on the process, not necessarily on the outcome. The outcome can be there, and it's nice to have the dream of winning your club championships, making your national team, all of that, but you need to strip it down into the processes. So some athletes, Anthony Joshua, Michael Phelps, Serena Williams, Conor McGregor, Nick Matthew, Ali Farag, Raneem Al-Walili, they all do the visualization. There's so many. I was lucky enough to speak to a lot of the squash players about their visualization, but so many athletes talk about their visualization and what they've done with it. So it's a thing, it happens, and it's happening all the time. It is evolving a little bit. Now's not necessarily the time or place to talk about it, but there's a whole big concept on negative visualization as well, where you're visualizing the worst case scenarios and you're putting interventions in place to deal with it. I love that topic, and I'm doing a lot more of that, but that's something to think about for the future. I want to talk really briefly about Dr. Biasato at the University of Chicago, one of a very famous study, and it's been repeated multiple times since. So he did a basketball accuracy study, so it was for free throws. And so he'd get a group of players and they would do all their free throws. He split the group up into 3 different groups. Group 1 had 30 to 40 minutes of practice every day for 6 weeks. Group 2 did no practice whatsoever. Group 3 did no practice, but visualized the same things that the practice group were doing. So they were going through the motor skills, what parts of the body were being used, the flights of the ball, the outcomes, the processes, what part of the court they were doing it from. And they did the same amount of time with visualization as the practice group. So when they came to retest the groups, Group 1 scored 24% better. So pretty significant, 24% improvement. You'd expect quite a big improvement with amateurs and novices. Group 2, that did nothing. There was no significant improvement. It pretty much was baseline level. But Group 3, who hadn't thrown a basketball for 6 weeks, improved by 23%, which is crazy to think about. Think about it was almost the same amount of improvement as the players that were actually throwing the balls. These guys and girls were sitting and visualizing and going through it. Okay, there's an argument that wasn't a pressure situation and it was one skill, get that, but the fact that there was a huge improvement from the control group, the group that didn't do any visualization, from the group that did, I think it's unbelievable that it does work. And they've repeated the study in multiple sports, darts, golf in particular does a lot of these type of studies. And for me, what's getting really interesting is this in-field study now. And so there's studies currently being conducted whereby combining visualization within the part of the physical practice is being tested. They haven't produced any data on it yet, but most of the studies now have had like one group practicing and one group visualizing, whereas now there's a much more of an overlap. I know in rugby, I've heard a few things they're doing in rugby with this, where they'll run a play, they'll get the players all back in the same point of the field, they'll all get them to close their eyes on the field for a minute or two, and actually not move, but run the play in their minds, and the coach will roll the ball in, right, go play. So I'm so excited to see how these go. And actually on a personal level, I've started to introduce it a lot more into my play. So working on certain shots with players. Sometimes we get a bit bogged down with the technique and really trying to look at the fine details. So we'll hit 30 shots now. I'll put a little visualization intervention in 1 minute, nothing too hectic. I'll give them a bit of a prompt what to think about. Then we'll go back and hit again. Then we'll stop and we'll come visualize. So I'm starting to pepper in visualization within the hitting. And just in the very short term of about a month or so, there's been significant improvements in some of the execution of the shots. In particular, what one of the players came to me and said was fascinating. They turned around and said, you know what, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how I'm doing it, but I feel so consistent. I feel I can do it every single time. And that for me was magic, because that was going into the subconscious type brain, which I'm going to talk about to end this little visualization process. So I really love the idea. If the athlete can reproduce the skill, but actually not cognitively, but because of the nervous system, the subconscious brain taking up the workload, that's where the real power starts to happen. Okay, so this whole process can be summed up very neatly in Hebb's law, which states that neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that if we continually have thought patterns or continually do something time after time, then the neurons in our brain tend to strengthen that learning. So that's a lovely way to put it. Neurons that fire together wire together. Us as coaches, me in particular with the SquashMind, really trying to fire up those parts of the brain that are gonna have a proper impact on the players and wire them together so they become stronger. Dr. Joe Dispenza, an amazing neuroscientist, he's studied hundreds of brain scans of subjects who were given visualization interventions. This is his life's work, and I just love listening to him. He's got some really cool podcasts out there. What he says, the act of rehearsing what you're going to do begins to neurologically install the hardware in your brain to look like you already did it. Now the brain is no longer a record of the past, but a map of the future. And if you keep installing that hardware, the hardware will become a software program. I think that's just beautifully put. And this is on literally like live scans of people's brains, thousands of them. I want to repeat that a little bit. The brain is no longer a record of the past, but a map for the future. think that's really powerful. If you can get your players understanding that or buying into that, some beautiful work there. And then very finally, the subconscious brain. So as you may or may not know, studies have shown that the subconscious brain is over 10,000 times quicker at processing information, making decisions, adapting and reacting than the conscious brain. You all might have heard of paralysis by analysis, that whole concept of that, where the more our conscious brain tries to take up the workload and the more we force it, we just get in the way of ourselves. So if we need to improve our subconscious decisions, we need to make concerted efforts inputting data and working on those neural pathways with the conscious effort, the visualization. For me, the subconscious brain can't take up the workload if there's nothing being put into it. You need to put some active stuff into it. So all the stuff I've talked about, the brain scans and the tests and the athletes talking about it, that's the conscious input. When we get to a certain point, we want the players to then trust in their subconscious. That's a whole other discussion to talk about as well, about trying to dial down the conscious brain when pressure is on, trying to problem solve in the moment, which is part of squash, of course, but can we make the subconscious brain take up a bit of the workload? Okay, so visualization. I'm sure some of you have heard some of that stuff before. Hopefully there might be some new learning in there, but I'm always of the opinion that if you've heard something or you know something about it, if someone says the same thing in a slightly different way, it can maybe just color it as well. It can maybe just make you look at it, go, reinforcing what you already know in a slightly different way. So hopefully that helped as well. I'm thinking about the visualization stuff. Okay, cool. I'm going to take a little pause for a sec before we move on. Again, I see one chat in there. Great for now. I'm hoping for a few more to be thrown in, but as I said, I will open up some Q&A type stuff as we go along. Okay, so the SquashMind philosophy. I just want to spend a second on this. So my screen's a bit blocked, so I'm just having to do it on my phone a little bit. And I've thought long and hard about this philosophy, and hopefully this gives you all a bit of a direction about what SquashMind is, why the mental training is there, what I believe is going to be the most impactful for the players. So I'm just going to read it word for word because I think the words I've used are quite important to kind of define what it is. So the art of improving mental toughness isn't a set of teachings or formula to memorize. It's a practice that requires constant work. The progress you see is better than any proclaimed. No one ever got good by sitting and theorizing over it. The real improvements come from the practical application of the theory with the appropriate tools on a steady and consistent basis over time. You need to get your reps in. So I always come back and remind my players of this. I'm asking them, going, right, do you understand the theory? Because I think the theory is really important to understand. It's probably one thing that let me down, or the sports psychologists I saw when I was a player, they never really went into the theory of it. So I've spoken to you guys about the theory of the visualization, some of the growth and fixed mindset. I go into so much more detail about breathing techniques, what nervousness is, how to deal with pressure, how to make yourself more aware. I bring a whole mindfulness concept into it, but we talk about why, the theory behind it. But once you've got the theory, you need to have the tools to be able to now apply it. And once you've got the tools, it's about a steady and consistent basis. I'm not asking players to go, right, do 2 hours on a Monday and 2 hours on a Wednesday and 2 hours on a Friday. I'm asking for 3 to 5 minutes on a daily process. Frequency, in my opinion, trumps duration. And not in my opinion, this has been some interesting studies on frequency over duration. So if you repeat the task, say 5 minutes every day for 7 days, that's 35 minutes, whether it's a visualization or whether it's breathing exercises. Or if you do 1 hour on a Monday and only do 1 hour the next Monday, so you do more in that hour, but because it's not the frequency, it doesn't really go into the subconscious, doesn't really get into you. So frequency over duration. So I hope the SquashMind philosophy gives you a little bit of an indication into things. I'll run through this one really quickly. SquashMind in action. Currently, as Jeffrey said at the start, I did WSF, well, I did the presentation, but what's happening now is SquashMind and the syllabus is going to form part of the psychological components in the new level 2 and 3 courses, which I'm being really excited and honored to be asked to contribute to their psychological side of that. Squashskills.com, as I said, I'm the squash director there, but I also have now been tasked with bringing in the whole psychological component of the website. With the SEA, the Squash Education Alliance, which you might know in America, they work with all the urban youth programs. I'm currently one of them. I do coach education with them. So every couple of weeks we meet, we do a Zoom conference on the concepts of SquashMind, and then they go filter it out into their players. And some of the feedback's been really great so far, especially players from really disadvantaged backgrounds where they're starting to get stuff on the mind really tuned in really nicely. I tend to do weekly workshops with families in the UK, USA, Australia, and this is really good fun, you know, checking in, giving them tasks each week. So it's not just the app itself, it's online stuff. And, you know, it's currently got, I think I've got 7 or 8 families in the US. And again, maybe that leads me to my last bit, some of the players. I've got a few players ranked in the top 30 in the world, professionals. UK #1 under 15 girl at the moment is using the SquashMind concept and philosophy. US #1 under 15 boy, and then a couple of under 17 boys and girls that are decently ranked in the US. So that's a bit of SquashMind in action at the moment. Those are more the workshop ones. I know I can see the app downloads and people have downloaded the app, which is really great and kind, and I feel humbled and honored about it. So yeah, it's being used pretty okay so far, I think. And then very last bit I want to just talk about and present about what the app has and the features. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment to actually just run through it with you really quickly. So first time I'm doing this, so bear with me a split second. So if I stop sharing, there's another little bit I want to have a go at. And this should work, hopefully, fingers crossed. Yes, it does look like it will. So it's better for me to show you the app directly from the app itself, I suppose. I think you guys can see that screen. It's kind of showing it's okay there. So right, this is the SquashMind app. I'm going to go through the little bits of it very simply. As you see along the bottom, there's 4 different tabs. There's the home tab, lessons tab, pre-match tab, journal tab. And then in the top right here, we have a little drop-down menu. Drop-down menu goes through a whole bunch of things. You could search for any of the lessons. So you could search for something like forehand, for example. And there's a whole bunch of lessons that come up: forehand lob under pressure, forehand drop shots, forehand straight length. Might search something about nerves. So you could search for nerves. There's 2 little lessons on nerves: calming the nerves and coping with nerves. Just go back to my home screen. Again, I'm not going to go through it in massive detail, but that's pretty much, there's a whole bunch of features there. Meditation timers, mindfulness challenges, a whole bunch of blogs. So some cool little features on that section. If we look, this for me has been a really interesting process so far, which is the podcast section. So every couple of weeks I'm releasing new podcasts, and I've been lucky enough to have such a range of great people on the podcast, going from James Wilshop, Sarah Fitzgerald, 5-time world champion, Nick Matthew, 3-time world champion, Ross Norman, Laura Massaro, and then I get some really top sports psychologists: Gareth Mole, Stuart Armstrong, Amanda Sobey, and it's just growing. I've got Marwan Shabagi was one of the early ones, which was really cool, and I've got Mohammed Shabagi coming out soon. And we just go into massive detail around the mind. All this podcast is all based on getting in the weeds with the mind, really understanding it. This lesson section is probably where the meat of the app is. And there's all the playlists along the top. So you can go into something like theory, and there's a little 9-minute lesson on acceptance. I won't play it necessarily. The app simply opens, and it'll go through the 9-minute lesson on acceptance, and goes from everything from, you know, mindsets, technique, tactics, movement. So there's all these different scripts in the app for you to listen to get your players to listen to. So there's a visualization lesson on the forehand straight drop, for example. It's being added to the whole time and being improved and built on. This section is seeming really popular at the moment, the video guided bit. So for example, there'll be a short little lesson on, say, Wilshop defense into attack. So a little video starts. I'm not going to go through it with you, but a little video will go, and it's my voice pointing out the key aspects, and then the players do a visualization based on that. I'm going to be doing a lot more of the video guided stuff, because the more research I'm done, if you get that visual stimulus, you can really get into the deep visualization on it. I'm conscious, I'm going to run through these next bits really quick because I'm conscious of time. Pre-match, really quickly, these are what they say on the tin, little pre-match sections. You know, if you want to start, well, a little 4-minute lesson as you're warming up. If you're playing against the shot player, right, a little 3-minute lesson about how do I play against a shot player. And general is stuff like confidence, reducing anger, getting more focus, getting more motivation. And the final section of the app, the one big one that I built quite recently, I'm really proud of this one. This one I think is doing some really good stuff. It's all journals, but stuff like game planning. There's a game planning script. So I get players to write down, how do I win most of my points? What do I want to play like? What do I want to happen? What do I want to prevent from happening? And then they can do stuff on their opponents, and then they can do a little bit of a match review as well. Initial thoughts about the match. Was I able to execute my game plan? And what actions do I now need to take? So there's a whole bunch of journals there that go through, you know, talking about opponents, to best matches, to problem solution. Goal setting is a huge one. Practice journal to get the players practicing more. So yeah, and the app is being built the whole time. It's continually got a few little things added to, but hopefully that gives you a quick little overview of what the app is and some of the key features around it. As I said, feel free to download it, free to download. You get 7 days free trial on it as you get it. And like I said, I'm going to give some 5 codes away at a certain point today. Whew, okay, right, I'm going to stop talking for a second, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Apologies for running slightly over with that, but I think it was quite important to get a few of those key little things in there. So I've seen a couple of messages in the chat. I think that's probably a really good place to start for now. So let me open up. I've not really seen what they are. So Simon says, very good concepts. Jesse, do you have self-talk advice during a match between rallies? A really good point, Simon. That probably links me to what I showed you just at the end there with the game planning document. So the game planning document is you go through your little game plans. It's probably easier for me to share my screen and show you, because this is, again, it's a really, really important note that you made there. And again, something I've been trying to get better at with my players as well. Okay, so, right. So here we go. So in the game planning, you'd ask these or answer these questions, but this is the big bit. What is my mantra? And so Simon, what I try to get the players to do is, yes, come up with a few mantras, a few sayings, a few sentences to be able to go, right, this is how I want to speak to myself between the games or between rallies, because you don't want to overthink. You don't want to get into this concept going, right, I need to do my backhand volley drop like this. And actually the mantras are never, ever, ever technical, by the way. The mantras are things that the player has full and ultimate control over. Move up higher on the tee, change the pace, get the ball longer, look for the volley. It's never anything to do with like the shape of the swing or the grip or anything that's too technical. So the mantras are there that will be based on the game plans above here, by the way. So these mantras lead to that. And what then eventually happens is, if you go right to the bottom, what actions do I now need to take? Once you've done your match review, you go through the thoughts, and part of that will maybe form some new mantras or reinforce some of the mantras you've already done. So I hope that answers that question. But again, a really, really important question, because it's a whole topic I talk. It's probably like 3 lessons I go over with the concept of overthinking, conscious, unconscious brain. How do we turn it on? How do we dial it down? What's our levels of stimulation? Are we overstimulated? Are we understimulated? Where do we go with that? So thanks for that question, Simon. On to Patrick. Instilling daily habits are beneficial to the commitment to stay to the growth plan. Completely agree. Daily habits, I do a whole bunch of lessons on habits. Very big on the concept of not overreaching and failing when we're starting off on this journey. Let's achieve the small wins really early on with the mind and cultivate those habits. I did say earlier about reach and fail, reach and fail, reach and fail. So I'm slightly contradicting myself here, but I think for the purpose of not overreaching, especially when we're looking to form habits, that for me is probably where we can define a little bit more. Again, whole bunch of lessons on habits. I could go off on big tangents there. Jeff says, what kind of things would you say to a player that might be hesitant or not interested in mental training? Yeah, I actually had this conversation yesterday on the podcast with a guy called Ken Way. So some of you might know Ken Way. You might know Mike Way more. So Mike Way is the coach at Harvard, and Ken Way is his brother. Ken Way himself is a high-level sports psychologist, worked with Premier League football teams, worked with Sarah Fitzgerald, so 5-time world champion, so he knows his stuff. His answer to that, I'll give you his very short answer, was, I don't know. So I think that was an interesting way to look at it. But what we then got into the discussion around was, everyone's on a bit on this journey, and athletes might not be ready to hear certain things around their mind. So it's the concept of, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I think as a coach, when someone is reluctant to the mental side of the game, it's about finding a very soft, gentle approach to just bring it into a conversation. I don't even think you don't ask them to do anything. You don't ask them to go work on their mind, but you maybe just interview them, and you just give them this little bit of motivational interviewing, is what I like to call it, around getting to think about the mind. And, you know, best case scenario, if they've done something, or they come to you and they or you've said something to them and they come back, oh yeah, I actually thought about that part of the match and it went really well, you've almost got the buy-in there. You've almost got them coming through that door. So I think that's an interesting one. Like, by no means don't discount those players, but they might not be ready in their journey to work on the mind yet, and you can't force that. If you force it, you'll probably lose the player, if I'm honest. I've made that mistake. I've insisted. I've come at it with a bit of a sledgehammer when all it needed was some you know, soft hands in that regard, but it didn't work in that sense. So that would be my advice. But don't dismiss it. Continually just have a little conversation, a little chat about it. Just plant a few seeds along the way. Cool. Let me get through the other couple, because I know we're pretty much running out of time, and I want to see if anyone else wants to open up. Are the visualizations that you would use, sorry, from Kit, are the visualizations that you would use differ depending on the level of the player? At the moment, no, because the visualizations ask you as the player to visualize yourself doing certain things within your skill set. So the video guided ones are, yes, based on like pro players doing pro stuff, but the way I then guide players through that is going, yes, that's the ultimate ideal goal, but actually I've maybe given 3 or 4 bullet points within that video lesson. Can you take 1 or 2 of those and just put it into your game? So even if it's like the Woolshop beautiful backhand volley drop he plays, you know what, maybe take a little element of that. Even if you're a slightly lower level player, if you can visualize it and try it, you know what, you're probably going to close that gap a little bit more. So the answer is no at the moment. Again, it's a good question. It probably gets me to think about, is it something worth doing in the future, to go, right, here's basic visualization, intermediate, and advanced, which is definitely something to think about. But most of the athletes I've spoken about, they've started visualizations at different points in their careers, but it's for their skill set they are in at that exact moment. So that's what I would answer that question like. But thanks, that's some really cool questions so far. Jeffrey says, question from Julie. Hey Julie, nice seeing you again. We've done a lot of work in the SquashMind training clubs. She was on one of my 6-week SquashMind training courses as well. So she says, is there an age range that you think that we should start visualizing with juniors, or is it more of an athlete being engaged in their training and wanting to improve, and or being mature enough to understand it? Yeah, again, it's hard to say age. I think it's definitely got to do with maturity levels. Is the athlete ready to hear it? Are they ready to walk through that door with you? As the coach, I think we need to keep ourselves very open and receptive to when that athlete comes through that door with you. If I'm running group sessions, even individual sessions, I will, even if I just carve out a few minutes of time to talk about the mind, even if it's a bit of a theory, just something that sparks the curiosity, whether it's a breathing technique thing, whether it's how we deal with nerves or pressure. So yeah, it's definitely athlete-centered in regard to this. It shouldn't be coach-centered in a way, because I think we all know the importance of the mind, but we shouldn't bang that drum so hard if the athlete's not ready for it. But that's a real skill set in itself, as the coach, to get that balance right between the two. Like, when do we come in and put some interventions in place? When do we let the athlete come to us? Because I think we all know this, when the athlete comes to us with those questions, the buy-in's automatic, and that's the easy win. But actually, as a coach, I think we can help the athlete to buy in by the way we communicate with them, by the way we show them stuff, by the way we actually get maybe passionate and excited about working the mind, and also possibly by the examples we set for ourselves. All the stuff I do, okay, I don't initially go into ridiculous visualization for technique and stuff, but a lot of the journaling, a lot of the theory I talk about, I practice myself. So I'm a custodian of the stuff I try and preach. So it's not just me preaching, do it, and I don't do it. So maybe that's a way to look at it. Cool, let me get through the last couple of questions. So Seb says, do you recommend a little mantra that you tell yourself between rallies to help you stick to your game plan? I often find that when my athletes start to feel it physically, they stray away from it. Yep, Seb, maybe very similar to what I said to the other answer, completely. Most of the interviews on the podcast, I ask about mantras, and they are so simple. Marwan Shabagi, move your feet. When he's at the business end of the game, he just says, keep moving my feet. When he feels nothing else he can do, Nick Matthew, classic, says push forward. That's his one, push forward, push forward. So those little mantras, very simple ones as well, not long strung out technical detail, stuff you know you can do, and trying to execute that to the best of your ability. So completely, I think those mantras get embedded quite deep at a certain point, but you also need to be flexible to change. So I'm working with a Scottish pro, a girl, 22-year-old, and she's gone so entrenched with her mantras, we're actually having to come out a little bit and readdress them and soften them for her to go back in, because hers were all quite hard, like almost overly aggressive, and it was getting her tense. So I think the mantras can also be flexible. And finally, I'll answer next question. How often do you suggest challenging, i.e. channel, imitate Nick, Matthew, Karim Garwad? Yeah, great question. How often? I don't know if I can put a timeline on how often that's going to be. What I think is quite easy, again, I just came up with a call with a player who just loves channeling plays. He is always talking to me about plays. So that's an easy one. I go, okay, well, here's the video of Marwan, and here's what Marwan Shabagi does on this shot, or this is what his tactic is. But in regard to you getting a player that you want them to channel, like Garwad or Nick Matthew or someone, again, go soft let it. See what the reception is like. Go, oh wow, that's really interesting. And if they are receptive, you can go with it. One trick I use, and I say trick, this I probably once every term, so once every kind of 12 weeks, I put on the shots of the month on the big screen at the club for my players, and even sometimes the players I see individual lessons, and actually just get them really excited about watching the PSA shots of the month, the trick shots, the flair, all this, and they get to know the players a little bit more. And that's actually quite an interesting way for them to buy into the style of play they want. And then you as a coach can maybe present little videos of Nick or Garwad or whoever it is to that player if they resonate with it. I'm not saying there has to be one player for one player the whole time. Do you know what I mean? Like I think the guy I'm thinking of, he loves 3 or 4 different players, and we try to take the best bits of all of those. So yeah, how often's a hard one, but I think it's also the buy-in of the athlete. But as a coach, if you can present it in a way that, hey, look how cool this is. Look at Garwad's cool shape on his backhand. And the player goes, oh, it's really cool, great. That's a cool way to channel it. So that would be my suggestion on there. But cool, listen, thanks for the questions in the chat. I know I have been taking up too much of your guys' time. I'm going to hand it back to Jeffrey for a second. I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer if anyone else has any more. But Jeffrey, any thoughts from your side?
That's great. Thank you, Jesse, for that outstanding presentation on SquashMind at Mental Skills Toolkit. I even found I learned a few new things that I'll take to, I don't play squash, but for my sport of curling, it's amazing how mental skills can really be applicable to all sports and all walks of life and what you do. So that was fantastic. So a couple of housekeeping things for tidying up today's webinar. So as Jesse and I mentioned at the start of the presentation, he's got 5 one-year codes for some lucky people on today's webinar. And so the way we decided we were going to reward the 5 codes is to the first 5 people who ask questions. So with that being said, Simon Hall, Pat Hartunian, Julie Maltamaki, Jeff Hippner, and Catherine Hanley will all be hearing from Jesse and I this week with respect to the code for you to access yourself, or however you see fit once we've provided that information to you. So stay tuned for that communication this week from Jesse and I. Other than that, go ahead, Jesse.
I just need to know if you're Apple or Android. So just when you let Jeffrey know, and Jeffrey, if you just say I need 4 Apple, 1 Android, I can then give you the codes from there.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so with that being said, as per usual, we have one more upcoming Squash Canada Coach PD webinar before we take a summer break, and it is Wednesday, June 23rd, and the timing of it is quite perfect for many of you as Canada starts to reopen a little bit from many COVID restrictions that we've been under for the last 2, 3, 4 months. The topic is COVID-friendly squash programming that was done for Ontario a few weeks back. It will be, again, as I said, Wednesday, June 23rd, and presented by Mark Porter from the Toronto Lawn Tennis Club. So register for that, and we look forward to your participation in that webinar. Again, thank you, Jesse, for your great presentation, and thank you, everybody, for joining today, and we look forward to you on the next one.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time and effort. Thanks for the messages coming through, and listen, be in touch if you can.